Let's start with the director. Miike Takashi is his name in Japan. Internationally, people tend to reverse the order of Japanese names and call him Takashi Miike. But either way, he was born, I think, in 1960. Working class family, Osaka, and was interested in film from quite an early age, and eventually went to film school. He went to, at that time in Japan, there weren't any film schools. There was only one, in fact, which was a private one run by the filmmaker Imamura Shohei. Imamura started a film school because he believed there ought to be some formal tuition outside the studio system in Japan for would-be filmmakers. So he started his own school, first of all in Yokohama, then it later moved the other side of Tokyo to a place called Shin Yurigaoka, and he taught students there. Nice place, good training, I think, good technical training at least, and probably conceptually quite good training as well. And after he graduated, Miike became assistant to Imamura on a couple of films. He worked, I think, on Zeigen and Black Rain, before leaving and going off to do his own thing. And in the early 90s, he became very quickly established as a very successful and incredibly prolific director of direct-to-video features. These are the days, of course, of VHS tape rather than DVD or Blu-ray discs. And in Japan, there was quite a large industry known as V-cinema, or video cinema, of production specifically for buying and renting videotapes. So not stuff that was already out in theatres, but stuff made directly for video release. And Miike became something of a specialist in this area and churned out an enormous number of these things from, I think, 91 onwards. In 95, he made his first feature for cinema, which was a film called Shinjuku Kuroshakai, Shinjuku Black Society. The subtitle is China Mafia Senso, China Mafia War. And it's set in Kabukicho, which turned out to be his recurrent favourite location over many decades, actually, now. Kabukicho is the entertainment red light district of Shinjuku in Tokyo, and there have been attempts, as in Times Square, to clean it up in recent years, but it's still basically a rabbit's warren of little brothels and clip joints of various kinds, after-hours bars full of yakuza, gangsters, and other low-life types. Miike's natural habitat, the way he tells it. And his first feature, 1995, as I said, was an attempt to get to grips with the racial mix, the tension between the Chinese gangsters who were invading the area and the Japanese yakuza who'd been there for donkey's years. It was a film of some perversity with quite a number of strong gay elements in it, as has much of his later work. And it was deliberately quite sensational. It created a rather startlingly surprising and perverse vision of the way the cops are, the yakuza are, and the Chinese gangsters are. All dope crazed, all gun crazed, all just crazed, pretty much period crazed. This turned out to be the first in a trilogy of Black Society or Triad Society movies, unrelated in theme, but all related by the notion of triad gangs gone a bit wrong somehow. And it also turned out to be the beginning of a very, very prolific as his video days had been, filmmaking, a career as a film director. And he started, at the beginning he was a bit slow because he was still making some video films, I think. But very quickly he was up to 5, 6, 7 films a year. This is the rate of production that we associate with filmmakers in the 1920s when they're making films without sound and churning things out. I mean, it reminds me of the prolificness of, for example, the young Raoul Walsh in the late 20s or early 30s. He worked for William Fox's company at that time, and he was making also 4 or 5 or 6, sometimes 6 films in a year, and they were in widely different genres and were mostly pretty good. I mean, they were very inventive, very exciting, sometimes very shocking, sometimes deliberately provocative. These were, of course, pre-code years, so it was possible to get away with, obscene jokes and all kinds of dubious moral inferences that would be outlawed a few years later. Anyway, Miike also was quite transgressive. He was seemed to take great pleasure in bending the rules or showing the most outrageous things, or pretending at least to show the most outrageous things, because of course in Japan at the time full nudity, for example, was outlawed and had to be concealed through pixelation. But if you could imagine what was behind the pixelation in some of Miike's early films, you would be very startled, because there were some really quite shocking things going on. Anyhow, he established himself in the second half of the 1990s as a very inventive, creative, dynamic director of a variety of genre films. He was rarely the originator of his projects, but he was to be relied upon in most cases to do something very startling with the material, something that would give you a result a little different from other films in the genre, and which encouraged you to feel that you were seeing something new, something for the first time, something you hadn't seen before. And I met him around that time and asked him, how many films did he turn down? I said, because you're working incredibly prolifically, you're making so many films. Do you actually turn stuff down ever, or do you just do everything that's offered to you? And he said, no, I do turn things down sometimes, but my policy generally is to say yes, as long as there is something in the script or the project or the proposal that I think I can do something with. So I assess the material and I say, okay, I think I could make something of this, then I go for it. And that's why I'm working round the clock, basically. I'm working year round. Hardly a month goes by when I'm not at work on something. So he built quite a reputation and some festivals, including Vancouver, Fantasia in Montreal, a few others, a few specialist fantasy film festivals around the world were showing isolated films. They were picking films out from this vast mass of films that he was producing. But I think the breakthrough came in 1999. And in 1999, he made at least 4 features, maybe more. I off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly, but there are at least 4 I can think of. One of which was a film called Audition, which we're all here to celebrate. And Audition, I think, was the 3rd film that he made that year, if I remember correctly, preceded by the first in the Dead or Alive series, and also by the last of the Shinjuku, of the Triad Society series, which is called Nippon Kuroshakai, Japan Black Society. Ley Lines is the subtitle, which again has almost nothing to do with the first 2 films in the trilogy, but they're linked by title, and they're all about marginal figures in triad societies and yakuza societies. So he finished off one series, started another, and then made Audition. Audition came as a commission, like most of his films. He was invited to make it by a new company called Omega in Tokyo, who were setting themselves up, and they were very proud of their beginnings, and they had acquired the rights to a novel by Murakami Ryu. Murakami Ryu was kind of the Miike of the Japanese literary world. He had also made a mark with rather sensationalist books, but worse, he had directed film versions of a couple of them himself. So he was known for titles like Tokyo Decadence, Topaz, in which he had his then girlfriend conduct various experiments in sadomasochism. I mean, she was seen in numerous undignified positions and postures for our delectation as we explored the delights of S&M. He wrote Coin Locker Baby, he wrote Almost Transparent Blue. These are all books with some kind of tabloid angle to them. They all have something about them that makes them sensational in terms of the public appetites, in much the way that a tabloid newspaper reaches for sensation or a sensational spin to make its stuff more saleable, more exciting, more salacious or whatever. So I wouldn't say Murakami was exactly a literary figure, although he did win one or two literary prizes. I think his ambitions were altogether more commercial and more calculated, if you'd like to say. I don't think he ever thought of himself as primarily a literary figure. Anyhow, he wrote this book, Audition, which is it's a novel about a 40-something man, ex-advertising executive, who has been widowed. He's been a widower for 7 years. He has a teenage son, and his son is urging him to remarry, saying, remarry Dad before it's too late. So I don't think we need to issue spoiler alerts here, because I assume that people either have seen the film or are about to see the film. But in any case, his strategy, the urging of a colleague in the company, he decides to hold fake auditions for a project that they have in fact abandoned or given up as unrealizable. And they audition actresses for it, and he is supposed to look at these actresses not as potential actresses, but as potential wives for him to remarry. And even before we get through the auditions themselves, he has looked at the papers that people have sent in, the application forms, and has already fixed his attention on one particular person who comes almost at the end of the parade of women who are being auditioned, and who fulfills his expectations based on reading her application form. Well, for the first 3/4 of its length, it develops into a tentative romance between these two, between a middle-aged man or middle-aging man and a significantly younger woman. She's in her perhaps early 20s, when he's perhaps in his early 40s. But she, like him, has a history. And when he reveals that he has been married and has a teenage son, her attitude to him seems to change a bit, and she mysteriously comes in and out of his life. She sometimes strings him along and sometimes plays very hard to get. And he's rather baffled by the whole procedure, and anyway consumed by uncertainties about the age difference between them, about whether what he's doing is ethical or moral. He has all the kind of doubts that any middle-aged man might have going into a new relationship 7 years after the death of your wife. Well, the novel exploits all of that. It explores it in a quite needling way, I guess. It looks at the anxieties on the man's side, but it also suggests, and it may just be the man's paranoia, that the woman is not all she seems, and may be some kind of femme fatale, maybe some kind of threat, danger to the man. This is partly, I think, a response to a new feminist current, although it must be said that of all countries in the developed world, Japan is one of the least feminist, one of the least feminist-aware countries that you can think of. I mean, most people still think nothing about rape, and most Japanese pornography or sexual material of all kinds is still predicated almost entirely on rape, and nobody bats an eyelid. Nobody thinks that this is in any way strange or deplorable or in any way unconventional, in fact. So you have a very strange sexual culture in Japan. In many ways, it's completely free of Christian morality, so it doesn't carry that burden of guilt around its neck. But it has all kinds of characteristics that many in the West would find very startling, very surprising, in that it's completely open to all kinds of perversity and violence and sexual violence of all kinds in a way that would be considered, I think, unacceptable in most countries. That has not been met with feminist challenges in Japan, which is perhaps a surprise to the rest of us, but it is the case. So the novel plays on male fears that women may be dangerous. And I don't think this is exactly a misogynistic point of view, but it is certainly a view that perceives an enormous gap between the perceptions of the two sexes, between male gaze and the female gaze, the male expectation and the female expectation, and senses danger in that gap. So sets out to explore that danger, and either in reality or in the mind of Aoyama, the man, builds up a paranoid fantasy, or possibly a reality, a steady apprehension of a reality, that the girl is in fact scarred by all kinds of appalling experiences in her youth and has turned into some kind of psycho killer who is interested only in totally possessing any man that she liaises with, and is willing to do things like cut off his feet to ensure that a man stays with her because that will prevent him from getting away. This motif, you may recall, was also floated by Stephen King in his novella Misery, where Kathy Bates in the film version played the woman who decided indeed to get rid of her passion's feet in order to stop him from running away, and that may well have been a source of inspiration for Mr. Murakami in his novel in Japan. Don't know, can't say for sure, but it is perhaps more than coincidental that these two motifs occur in such close proximity. Anyhow, back to Omega. Omega have bought this book, bought the film rights to it, and they approached Miike, who by now has a big reputation, at least in Japanese film circles, and a burgeoning one internationally because of the festivals that have shown isolated films, to do a film version of this. And Miike suggests to ask an old friend of his to write the script for this, not allow Mr. Murakami himself to do it, despite the fact that he's directed a couple of adaptations of his own novels, but ask somebody else to come in. And by his account, Murakami was quite open to the idea that somebody else coming in might bring something new to the material and might freshen it up in certain ways or have a different perspective on it. The person he turned to was a young man who called himself Tengan Daisuke. And Tengan happens to be the son of Imamura Shohei. I guess he took the name Tengan because he wanted to disguise, or not, at least not benefit or profit from his association with his father. Anyhow, Tengan has made a couple of films himself. He made a rather good short film to begin with, and then made one of the Mike Hammer series of international adventures, starring the alleged private eye from Yokohama, Mike Hammer. And then has moved on since. He's made various things since, including a rather good film, I think, with Ishibashi Ryo, who is the male star of Audition, a film called Aiki, in which deals with martial arts and disablement. Anyhow, he's an old friend of Miike's, probably from the film school days. I don't know. I think they must have met at or in the film school. I don't think Tengan was a student at the film school. And because they're friends, Miike decides that Tengan is the man to adapt this book. He thinks he's psychologically in tune with it and he can make the most of it and bring something fresh to it. I haven't read the book, which I don't think has been translated, so I can't tell you for sure very much detail about what was changed. But apparently, according to Miike himself anyway, who did talk about this, the film is quite close to the book for most of the time, at least the first 3/4 of the film, which charts the nervous romance between these two who've met under false pretenses, essentially, because of the fakeness of the audition. The last quarter, which is in which the section of the film in which things turn a bit hairy, everything changes direction and it becomes quite hard to watch for some people, because torture is involved. The last quarter is a little different from the book, apparently. In the book, I gather that Aoyama's feet are both cut off by the girl. In Tengan's screenplay, according to Miike, no feet are cut off. In the film that Miike made, one foot is cut off. He reached the perfect compromise between the original novel and the screenplay, which opted for more reticence or more ambiguity. So maybe the film that he made was somewhere in between the novel and the screenplay, it would be fair to say. To get back to our story of Miike, the three films that I've mentioned, the first Dead or Alive, the last Black Society trilogy film, and Audition itself, all showed in the Rotterdam Film Festival. I think it was 1999, it may have been the year 2000, I can't recall. I'd have to look it up, but it would be easy to check if you wanted to really be exact about it. That was Miike's real serious introduction in a mainstream cinephile European context. It was the first time that his films had played in a fairly mainstream festival with a general audience, and boy, did they have an impact. I was working at Rotterdam at that time, and I had the pleasure of actually introducing the first screening of Audition in the festival, which took place in an enormous theatre, in the largest screen in the Pathé Multiplex, which has well over 1,000 seats in it. It was full. It was packed, and I told the audience that I was glad to see so many people had come, and that I warned them that some of them would be crawling to the exit by the end of the film. So I wanted them to be warned that this was a tough watch, this film. I say the same to viewers of this DVD Blu-ray. The film is quite extreme and quite challenging, and there are scenes in it that do invariably drive people out of the theatre. There are some audiences who just can't take it, just can't watch it. I won't go into detail about what they are because I don't want to spoil it for anybody who wants to toughen themselves up for this. But it is true that the film goes into areas of really quite extreme torture with a slight sexual edge that many will find extremely disturbing. So let's leave it at that. At the end of the film, we came back to do a Q&A, Mike and myself, and his translator. And I remember as we were waiting to take the microphone and go up, a middle-aged woman who was decided not to stay for the Q&A, but had watched the whole film, came past us at the front of the house and just hissed at Mike. "You are sick," she said. And he was, of course, delighted by this. He was delighted to have got this kind of response. He felt, yes, I reached her, I touched her. Given what he shows in the film, I don't think it was that difficult to touch her, because the film is, genuinely quite extreme. It goes further than you might think, although not as far as he would later go in films like Itchy the Killer and some others. Anyhow, in the Q&A, it emerged that the film had gone down the storm. And I think Mike's international fame really dates from that festival, or those festival screenings. I think Dead or Alive 1 also went down extremely well. Ley Lines, probably a bit less so, because it is a much more low-key film. But the fact that he had 3 films, all made in the recent past, playing in the same festival, and that he was there himself to kind of bask in the glory, really established him. It made people aware that here was a really singular filmmaker who was A, very prolific, B, very inventive, and C, very provocative. And the combination, plus his sort of elfin charm of the man himself in Q&A sessions. I did a rather memorable one where he accused me of having a much more debauched sex life in Tokyo than he had himself, which is, I don't know, may or may not have been true. I think probably not, but who knows. It got a laugh from the audience for sure when he said it. But the whole experience cemented his reputation. He'd gone because, of course, he was making a film. He couldn't stay in the festival for very long. He was only there for maybe 4 or 5 days. And by the end of the festival, he'd gone back to Tokyo, and one of his assistants had stuck around. And when Audition won a prize at the festival, Rotterdam is not a prize festival. It doesn't have a competition in the sort of Cannes sense, but it does give some awards on the closing night, given by mostly independent juries. And I forget which one Audition won, but it did win something in Rotterdam. And one of the assistants went up, holding in front of his face a copy of the festival's newspaper, the Daily Tiger, tiger being the symbol for the Rotterdam Festival, and there had been a huge portrait of Mike on the front of one day's edition of the Tiger, and he just went up holding the portrait of Mike in front of his face as if it were a mask to receive this prize. And all he said was that Mike would be thrilled to get this, he would be delighted to get this. And the message passed back to me from Mike when he phoned him to pass on the good news was, if ever you want me to do something somewhere, just tell me, I'll be there, because he was delighted to have some significant international recognition for the first time, really. So this is only 4 years after he's begun directing cinema features. So he's still pretty early on in the career. He's still knocking them out at an amazing rate. But from 1999 or 2000 onwards, when this event in Rotterdam happens and his Africa where he's launched. Audition in particular is sold widely around the world for distribution. It becomes a sensational film, in fact, in many countries. It challenges censors in some countries because of its extreme violent horror in one scene in particular. It makes Miike's reputation. He becomes a name to conjure with, and I remember British press reports from Rotterdam about that screening and the kind of impact it had on people. People were, I think, genuinely startled for the first time in many years. Actually, a filmmaker had managed to show them something that they found truly startling, shocking, amazing, in some cases horrifying, but boy did it have an impact. So as we've said, the film hinges on, or the story hinges on the novel as well, hinges on the awkwardness and the uncertainties, the paranoias, the fears, the potential dangers in a relationship between a middle-aged widower and a much younger woman. And the film could in large part be seen as an expression of the paranoia of the man. But there does seem to be something genuinely dangerous and damaged about this woman. The film makes it quite hard to be explicit about this, to be absolutely sure of your ground. You can't be certain what is fantasy and what is reality. And that's particularly true in the final stage of the film, the last quarter, which is when the girl does take steps to make Aoyama hers forever and to deal with his teenage son, get him out of the picture, as it were. But these scenes in which he takes these steps, which again we won't detail because we don't want to spoil anything for people who haven't watched it yet, are interspersed with other scenes which show alternative realities, other stages of their relationship. In some cases, flashbacks to things we have seen earlier, but playing slightly differently. So we will see a scene in a resort hotel, for example, where they're having something to eat across a table, and it's reprised from what we have seen earlier, but the dialogue is a little different this time. So there are subtle changes and changes of emphasis and so on. For me, certainly when I first saw the film, I found the time slips between this reality and that reality, especially if the other reality was something that was a flashback or a reference back to something we'd seen earlier, actually more scary probably than the element of torture in the action, which is what disturbs most people, and obviously is disturbing. I'm not denying that for a moment. But the time slips are so rapid and so momentous in their impact that actually they themselves add to the terror of the entire episode at the end of the film. You're never quite sure which is the reality. You're never quite sure. He's being tortured. Is he now thinking back to that time and remembering it differently? Is that why it's like that? Or this torture that he's going through now, is this his fantasy, his paranoid fantasy about what she might inflict on him, which goes through his mind at this earlier point? Are we now going back to the earlier point, and which way does the projection work? And the film doesn't make it clear. The film leaves it deliberately ambiguous, although it does suggest at the very end that some kind of understanding is reached between the man and the woman, but in terms that many people will also find quite disturbing. To me, the impact of the film is much to do with this. The film has been greeted as both pro-feminist and misogynistic. It's been called both things by different critics or different audiences. And I think it's a mistake to call it a feminist film because, as I tried to suggest earlier, Japan doesn't really have a feminist movement in the sense that Western countries do, and there is a small feminist movement in Japan, but it's very isolated and marginalized. And most notions of feminism in Japan are more to do with, Mizoguchi was called a feminist at one point in Japan, but that just meant having an empathy with a woman's point of view as she suffers, which is not quite the same as feminism in the West, I think, certainly in my understanding. And that kind of feminism, the Mizoguchi type of feminism of empathy with a suffering woman, is quite prevalent in Japan. There's plenty of that, and goodness knows women suffer a lot in Japan, especially in Japanese popular culture, where whole swathes of Japanese popular entertainment are predicated on the very idea of enjoying watching a woman suffer. So, this is not a surprise. But in this particular film, it's the woman who inflicts the pain, and she has suffered in the past. She has had an abused childhood. She's a dancer who was forced to suffer burns from charcoal tongs on her thighs as punishment for not dancing well enough, and all kinds of appalling things happen to her. And it is inferred, scarred her and turned her vaguely psychopathic, and certainly, changed her life and coloured her relationships with other people, particularly with men. But that doesn't make the film a feminist film either. And I think that it's hard to sustain the idea that the film is simply arguing from a point of view of empathy with a damaged woman, and that this is somehow, the damaged woman's revenge, because the film is overwhelmingly from Aoyama's point of view, from the male character's point of view. So I think it's much more to do with his paranoia than it is with her malice or her misandry, her hatred of men. But it's arguable either way, and neither Murakami, in what he says anyway about his original novel, nor Miike in what he says about the film that he made, nor Tengan when he talks about the script that he wrote, claims to be making a feminist protest against the way that men treat women in Japan. So none of them set out with that express intention, and anybody who reads the film that way, I think, is reading in or imposing a value where the film is more studiously neutral. The film, in fact, like many Miike films, presents an enigma, a puzzlement. Miike has made plenty of very conventional genre films which do have conventional resolutions and closures and, tie up all the loose ends, that kind of thing. But he's also made quite a few films that don't have such conventional resolutions and conventional closures, and in fact leave the audience to figure things out for themselves. Even the Black Society trilogy, usually, the convention of that trilogy became that he ended them with flashbacks to childhood, usually looking as if they were filmed on Super 8 footage, implying that the childhood provided a key to the way these people behaved in later life, but never explaining anything, just leaving the implication hanging in the air, sometimes as the end credits rolled. And Miike liked that kind of ambiguous ending. Dead or Alive, the film immediately before Audition, ends with a cataclysmic conflict between the good guy and the bad guy, or the two bad guys, as you may like to think of them, which escalates and escalates and escalates and becomes bigger and bigger until eventually the entire globe blows up. It ends with the death of the planet Earth, So that was a pretty, extreme ending in its way, and it was but amusing, droll, and provocative in its way, but a natural extension of the implications of the kind of final showdown that we found in so many gangster films. So prone to this kind of ending, which is not the conventional closure, but something a bit more suggestive, a bit more open, a bit more subject to interpretation, a bit more unspecific, non-specific about the general implications and the way that this might resonate in the mind. So I like to think of Audition as being another one like that. I think this is a film which deliberately doesn't resolve itself in any very clear-cut way. It is like a machine or mechanism, if you like, that allows the viewer to project into it what he or she wants and to find in it what he or she wants, but to come out of it essentially aware of ambiguities. So that you could even have an argument after seeing the film about whether this was his point of view or her point of view, or what was going on there actually. But there is no answer to it because it isn't resolved in the film. It's not a puzzle that needs decoding in that sense. It's a mechanism to provoke questions and uncertainties and doubts and fears and paranoias as well. So I think the effect of the film, the reason the film has been so resonant and so widely distributed around the world and had so much impact on audiences back in at the turn of the millennium and in the many years since then, is because it worked like that. If it had a more conventional closure, a typical ending for this kind of thing, I doubt it would have had the kind of impact that it has had.
Kitty, 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 kitty.